Hi everyone, welcome to what will either be your last or your second to last lecture in this experiment of distance learning. Let's go ahead and get into it. All right, a couple things before we get to content. I just want to point out a couple things on journals that you're going to do for this last week. One of, I think, your first journals for this week is about this article that Emma Gonzalez wrote, and this is a picture of Emma Gonzalez right here. And she is one of the survivors of the Stoneman, or the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas high school shooting that happened a couple years ago. And she really took that experience and turned it into activism. So I'm asking you to read this article about her and kind of her experience. I'm not interested, or the focus is not to do with gun control on this, but to think about how is it that she was able to turn this really negative, terrifying experience in her life into something where she could fight for others and what she thinks is right. So I'm interested in more whether you think you can articulate yourself like she's able to. Can you express yourself the way that she can? Can you communicate your thoughts the way that she can? And then if you were thrust in the spotlight, would you shrink or shine? These students were thrust into the spotlight because something terrible happened. And rather than kind of hiding in their home, kind of shrinking from society or shrinking from this moment, she's shining, and not in like that she's celebrating that this mass shooting happened, but that she's using that that event to propel her into doing something. So there's something that you felt strongly about, or something big happened in your community. Would you be able to shine? Would you be able to speak about those things or kind of fight for those things that you believe? And the last thing is there has been a lot of conversation about how strong and determined and these students' skills in organizing. And a lot of the kids connect that to preparation that the school did, that they had the resources and the teachers and the environment to teach them the skills necessary to be an activist or to get involved in these things. So I want you to think about whether you think CO is preparing you for civic engagement. Are they preparing you to be active citizens, to get involved in your community and to create change? And so that's going to be one of your first journal entries, one of your first and last journal entries from this week. All right, by now you absolutely should have finished 13th. Just a couple things I want to point out to you on that. Number one is I have taken the numbers that are in the film and I've plotted them for you on this. And what we're looking at is the population, or the percentage of the population that is incarcerated. So not the pure number. We don't want the pure number because our population has grown. But we want the percentage of the population that is incarcerated, right? Is that number growing? And what we see is that number is absolutely growing. So it only goes up to like 2015. And it's about 0.75%. And you're like, well, I'm going to see drugs. That's a really small number. But if we think about how large our country is, that's millions of people. And so we should be aware of that. And we also see that since 1970, that has drastically increased. So the percentage of our population that is incarcerated has drastically increased. Okay. All right. And then the other thing is the population that is disenfranchised. So those are the people who can't vote. Right? In some states, they have laws or rules that say if you have a felony, even if you've served your time, right, you gave back to society what society said you owed them, you cannot vote. You cannot get that constitutional right back. And so if we look at the number of people who are disenfranchised, even as we go through the civil rights movement, even as we protect people's right to vote, we see that that number has increased to almost 2% of our population that is not allowed to vote. So there's been a lot of activism around this, trying to decrease this and say if you've done a crime but you've paid for it in prison time, et cetera, that you deserve that right. You should be able to become a full citizen again. But if we take these numbers and we combine them and just for simplistic sake say this is about 3% of our population that is either incarcerated or cannot vote because of prior things. That's a lot of people. That's millions and millions of people in the United States. All right, and then this is just a scandal that happened in the last 4 months connected to this, particularly as that film that you watched talks about exploited prison labor and using those who are incarcerated to do jobs because it's cheaper. Michael Bloomberg, when he was running for president of the United States just a couple months ago, man, this has been a long year already, and we're only in May. he hired a third party to do his campaign phone calls, and they actually used prison labor to do that. So just the ridiculousness of Michael Bloomberg not doing his research and figuring out who's making those phone calls for them by using this exploited labor force and a right to get people to vote and a right that they don't have while they are incarcerated. It's not a good look for Bloomberg. All right. These are just some guiding things as you kind of think about that documentary. Number one, we want to think about, are people redeemable? And so I will give you an example of my husband. My husband was a knucklehead when he was younger. He got expelled from high school, all sorts of dumb things that he was doing in his life. And lots of times that he stole from stores. He has been put in handcuffs lots of times, but never incarcerated. And was able to come back from those things. So are people redeemable? And why is it maybe that my husband had that experience and some other people didn't? Okay. But should we allow people to come back from their mistakes? If we think about my husband, while perhaps he should have felt more consequences for his decisions earlier in his life, now he's an upstanding citizen. He is employed, he pays his taxes, he follows the rules most of the time. And so all those sort of things. So should we allow people to be redeemable? If you've served your time, you've finished your punishment, do we make room for you to come back into society? And what's good for society? I would like to think that people are redeemable and that making it possible for people to participate in their communities, to get jobs, to pay taxes, to be upstanding citizens is a good thing for all of us. If we leave people on the fringes where they can't access housing, they can't access jobs, so those create problems that perhaps we should really think hard about. All right, voting implications. I kind of talked about this in the last one. Florida has tried really hard, or activists in Florida have tried really hard to make it possible for those who have felony convictions but have done all of their things to be able to vote. This was a massive victory in the last election to get that passed for the people of Florida to support this. But the current governor and his administration are making that very possible, are very impossible for people to actually access that right again. I challenge you maybe to look some of that up. All right, and the last thing is one of the things about incarceration. What it does is we often build prisons in rural communities. And when we put prisoners in those rural communities, they count as population in those rural communities, even though they are incarcerated. So they count as population where they are incarcerated, not where they're from, not where their family lives, not where they have a room, right? But they can't vote. So what that does is it makes those rural communities have more power and have them look bigger, okay? So they have more of a influence in society. Their vote means more. Their politics means more because they get to count that incarcerated population. That's really problematic. If we think about the demographic differences, in rural communities, you're often talking about an all-white community. And if we know demographics of those who are incarcerated, they're disproportionately going to be Black and brown. So what we see is that those communities, those white communities, get to take advantage of that oversized representation. And they also are seeing marginalized people only as criminals. And that creates some really, really big problems, right? And it's also decreasing the electoral power of those urban centers where these people are coming from. And so it's doing really funny things to the voting districts and who has the power. And it's definitely decreasing the power from certain populations. All right. The last few things on 13th, these are some updates since the film was made. Crazy. I would never have guessed this, but one of the people that has been working on mass incarceration and trying to get certain people released from prison is actually Kim Kardashian. And she's been pretty successful in getting certain people released or advocating for certain people. So much so that I would say she's actually influenced Congress and she's gone to the White House and all these different things. Again, who would have thought? But what we saw in the last couple of years was Congress passed what's known as the First Step Act. And it's really trying to reform the criminal justice system and reduce the number of people that we have in federal prisons. It's a step. It's not a perfect act. It doesn't do as much as maybe it could. But it's a step that we haven't seen in quite a while. All right. Last two things I mentioned in one of the last lectures that we were going to spend some time talking about Supreme Court cases. So these are two more that you would see if you were going to go on to AP Government. Chavez is Reno. I'm just going to go over it super quickly. It's talking about gerrymandered districts. And so what that means is these are districts up here. These are our congressional districts. And you can see they're really funny shaped. Like, look at how far this one goes. What the Supreme Court says is essentially, can you do this by race? Can you try and do this so that it benefits certain races or certain communities? Like, look at this crazy one right here, this pink one right here. And the Supreme Court says, no. Okay. If something is this odd, okay, it can't just be because of race. There's got to be more to it. So essentially, this gives them the power to kind of investigate these things and determine what's going on. Gerrymandering is still absolutely a big deal because it's essentially congressional districts trying to pick who's voting for them. And it's a way of trying to either keep power or exclude other people from power. All right. This one right here has to do with gun-free zones. And essentially what it comes down to is Congress can't use commerce as justification for gun regulation. So Congress has the ability to regulate interstate commerce, right? And essentially the Supreme Court says in this case, the way that Congress is trying to push gun regulation is against the law, that they can't do that. Not that they can't have gun regulation, but they have to do it in a different way. All right, now we get Mr. Clinton. Okay, so this is the 1992 election, and you can see these numbers look different. Okay? It's not all red like we've seen in the past, and we're definitely seeing that pattern of a red South. You still see a little bit of blue, and that's partially because Clinton's from Arkansas, so you kind of see his influence in that. All right. So Bush Sr. is the incumbent, but he is going to lose. He's not as popular as his predecessor, Reagan. And so Clinton's going to win the popular vote. Unfortunately for Mr. Bush, Ross Perot is going to take some of those votes. So he's our third party candidate, and he takes almost 20 million of the popular vote. And if some of those had gone over here, Bush might have had a different outcome. But we get Clinton. And Clinton is considered a centrist. Even though he's a Democrat, he's going to sound very different than some other Democrats that we've heard, much to the annoyance of his party, because he's going to be so far to the center rather than more of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. All right, so this cartoon, I'm actually going to go over super fast. They're talking about an international crisis in Serbia, if I remember, and they're trying to figure out, what do you do? Okay, what do we do? How do we solve this problem? And at the end of the cartoon, the person says, I know, we'll just switch the channel. So I mentioned this in the last one when I was talking about the first Gulf War, but Americans just stop paying attention. We're just not going to pay attention to these crises that are happening around the world, ethnic cleansing, civil wars, all those sort of things. We're done. We're not paying attention. And there are consequences for that. All right, so Mr. Clinton's first term. I guess I'll see myself there. Okay, so in this picture, we have Clinton shaking hands with JFK. Okay, so sort of one generation and another generation of presidents. Okay? Right, so in the election, we had Bush versus Clinton and Al Gore, and then Ross Perot, which is our third party candidate. Clinton's victory is a surprise. Usually it's the incumbent that wins. And so his victory is a surprise. He's also the first baby boomer to become president of the United States. And again, he's very much on the center, so much to the anger of some people in his own party. He will appoint a lot more women and minorities to his administration. Bush Jr. will actually do more. We just don't talk about it as much, but we should. One of the first things he does in his administration is don't ask, don't tell. Essentially, he is trying to deal with the LGBT community in the military. And essentially he says, oh, I don't know, just don't talk about it. Military, don't ask questions. LGBT community, just don't talk about it. This really does not go over very well with anybody. Particularly, it seems like weakness in the military. But it's going to be the policy. And it will essentially be the policy until the Obama administration. We're also seeing the Veronia case, Supreme Court case, and that essentially says that that schools can do random drug tests. Essentially, it's not a violation of students' Fourth Amendment rights because while you are a student, you are under the supervision of the state, and they have an incentive to keep all people safe so they can drug test you. Heads up, I guess, when we ever go back to school. Okay. All right. The other thing that we're going to see under the Clinton administration is economic prosperity, which is why we see these budget surpluses, and one of the only times that we really made a dent on our debt. He doesn't really deserve credit for that economic growth. He does deserve credit for what he chooses to do that, or what his administration and Congress choose to do with that surplus, but not for the economic prosperity itself. And he just happens to get lucky. He's president when we have the dot-com bubble, where we see, the beginning of e-commerce, things that are very much part of our lives. So you're going to see this massive economic growth in the 90s. Okay. He is president when we have some of our first terrorist attacks. So we see an attack on the World Trade Center, and we see an attack on the Oklahoma City Trade Building. We're pretty slow to wake up to these things and respond to these things. For example, the World Trade Center in 1993, that's going to be the precursor to the attack on the Twin Towers in 2001. But we don't successfully deal with those things, obviously. Oklahoma City bombing is a really big deal because it's domestic terrorism, it's right-wing terrorism, and that bombing is actually in a big state building or a big federal building, but where the bombs are placed are right under a child care facility. And so many of the victims from the Oklahoma City bombing are the children. So it's terribly sad. Brady Belt, I mentioned this earlier under Reagan. Remember that his press secretary is shot in that assassination attempt. And so this will be background checks. It's not perfect, it's ineffective, but it's one of the few things that Congress has done when it comes to gun regulation and trying to deal with gun violence in the United States. We also will get FMLA, so Family Medical Leave Act. So families, if somebody is sick, if there's a new baby, they can get 12 weeks unpaid leave and still maintain their job. That is a win, but it's not a complete win. In most advanced nations, except for the United States, they have paid family leave. Sometimes it's even for like a full year. But we obviously don't have that. And you have to be in a financial situation where you can take 12 weeks off. So it's a little bit of a win, but there's a lot of holes and lots of things that we have still not solved almost 30 years later. All right. When we get to the 1994 midterm, so 2 years into his election, but congressional elections, what we're going to see is that Republicans are going to win. And so it's going to be harder for Clinton, or people think it's going to be harder for Clinton to get things done. This is kind of on the wake of a healthcare fiasco. Clinton had come in and said he was going to deal with health insurance and healthcare in the United States. And he actually puts Hillary Clinton in charge of that. But what they find is that it is much harder to fight that in the United States. There's so much money involved in healthcare and so many lobbyists and insurance groups that really fight that. And so it's a disaster. And that's going to help Republicans win in the midterms. The leader of Congress at that moment in time for the Republicans is this guy right here, Newt Gingrich. You'll actually see him in 13th. He's one of the people. And he and the Republicans come up with this idea called Contract with America, essentially more conservative ideas. So you have this, and then you have the Democratic administration of Clinton. But Clinton, being the political person that he is, he says, okay, well, I'll just move more to the center. Republicans, you think that you're going to be able to pull one over on me, but I'm just going to move more to the center. And so we see that with the crime bill and welfare reform, that Clinton starts to sound more like a moderate or a Republican than he does sort of what Democrats have been fighting for. So from a political standpoint, it's pretty successful. He's pretty smart when he does this. But if we think about a purity test about what it means to be a Democrat or what his ideology is, you see that he's flippant and people have questions about that. And we should, right? The other thing is his wife is a big part of who he is as a politician. They're very much a political couple. and we'll get to that when we get to the scandal as well in a second. But she is very successful in her own right. They actually met in law school. She was a successful lawyer all by herself. She had her own career. But she cared very much about politics, and she cared very much about her husband winning. And so they have an interesting relationship between them, the election. And so prior to being president of the United States, Clinton was governor of Arkansas. And then, the southern place, and she's not from the South. She's from Pennsylvania, I believe. And she is very much a product of the 60s. She had seen MLK speak. She was, product of the 60s with the big hair and the clothes of the 1960s. And so when Clinton loses his reelection bid in Arkansas, the campaign people are like, well, people of Arkansas didn't like you. You were too progressive, too liberal for this place. And so she makes a decision to essentially change who she is. There goes the big hair, the sort of the dress, and she's going to get more formal and more conservative. And he will win a different election after that. And so you might say she sold herself out, but you also might say she understood the political realities of that time and she made decisions. I don't envy her and the decisions that she thought she needed to make. But when Clinton will run for president of the United States, this is a time where we assume that women stayed home and hung out in the kitchen. And she's a successful lawyer. And somebody asked her what her cookie recipe is. And she does not like that question. It's insulting to her. And her response is, I suppose I could have stayed home and baked cookies and had teas, but what I decided to do was to fulfill my profession. So essentially, I don't have time to bake cookies. I'm a lawyer. But for many stay-at-home moms or more conservative women, that's a pretty insulting thing to say. So you kind of see her trying to find some sort of balance, and society definitely putting her in a box. Many of these issues of what I'm going to call sexism are going to come back to haunt her in the 2016 election. Obviously, the 2016 election is very, very complicated, but you see a lot of those things continuing to manifest themselves. And then this is Beyonce and Clinton at a campaign rally in the 2016 election. All right. Clinton's foreign policy, just like we saw Bush Sr. kind of struggle, Clinton's going to struggle too about if we're not communists, what is it? What are we? What are we doing? So I'm going to kind of skip this stuff. I'm just going to tell you that he's not very successful when it comes to foreign policy. Except the one thing that he is successful on is sort of promoting free trade, and so international trade, less so than the other stuff. However, we're going to get NAFTA. We're just going to ratify free trade between Canada and Mexico. That actually started under Bush Sr., and he'll sign it. This is the thing that Trump has been yelling about since the beginning of his time in office, and we've just gotten a new deal, although it looks very similar to this deal, but who asked in the future? And then the World Trade Organization. However, we will see a lot of protests, a lot of questions about what are the consequences of globalization? Like, who makes our products? How much are they paid? Does this come up in conflict with human rights issues? Like, so, for example, are people making a living wage? Okay, or are we exploiting their labor? Are children making our shoes? Are children making our t-shirts? If I buy a $5 t-shirt, what's happening in the supply chain that I can get a $5 t-shirt, because that's really cheap. So where are those products coming from? What's that doing to the environment? Who's physically making those things, et cetera, et cetera? What's happening to manufacturing in the United States? And so people start to ask some questions even as we are becoming even more globalized. All right, his second term in office, we're going to see affirmative action. His thing is going to be mend it, not end it. So much like Don't Ask, Don't Tell, he's like, I don't know, I just don't want to touch that. Too controversial for me. Okay. California will actually pass a law called Proposition 209 in 96 that will get rid of affirmative action. So public schools in California cannot use affirmative action. And it's crazy. Schools get less diverse when you can't take race into consideration. So it's problematic. That's still on the books. What schools do now is they actually do it by locations. They use geography to try and create diversity on campuses, which is really interesting because they're skirting the rules, but they recognize that we live in segregated communities. So if they pick students from, or they take where students live as part of the holistic look of students, that they might be able to use that to figure out or how to create diversity. Under the Clinton administration, we will see the Columbine shooting, which is the first sort of, it's not the first school shooting, but it's one of the first major ones. And it sort of starts this conversation about gun violence on school campuses and what do we do. Clearly, the answer is to have a global pandemic, since we've now gone 2 months, I think, without a school shooting, and that's because none of us are in school. I joke, but this is a problem that has now been haunting us for decades, and we have not figured out how to keep children safe at school, even though that is our job. All right. We'll also see the repeal of what is known as Glass-Steagall. Glass-Steagall is something that was passed during FDR's administration and the New Deal. So if you remember, that's a part of the Great Depression and trying to prevent a depression from happening again. And so repealing that is going to give banks and insurance companies more room to do funny things. So just deregulating them, it's putting less rules on them. And what we see is that this is tied to the financial meltdown of 2007. Essentially, when you reduce the number of regulations on these businesses, they start to create some new products or new ways of lending out money. And that ultimately is going to allow them to have less money on hand, which will contribute to that meltdown. This is it was a 2016 election issue, particularly if you listen to Bernie Sanders. He's always arguing about that we need to put Glass-Steagall back in and that we need to regulate big business or banks. Okay? We do see some work on big tobacco, trying to prevent people from smoking or limiting the number of people smoking and hold big tobacco accountable for that, because they've been lying to us for decades about how dangerous and how unhealthy big tobacco was. So there's a big lawsuit and essentially a settlement. It limits big tobacco's liability, so people can't individually sue tobacco companies. But big tobacco is supposed to produce anti-smoking ads. So ads so people that don't buy themselves, essentially, so kids don't get addicted. That seems like an odd thing to have big tobacco do. And it's actually not very successful because big tobacco makes them, but they're like the most boring ads ever, so that nobody will look at them. So they can say, look, we made anti-smoking ads. Not our fault that nobody paid attention to them. My stupid people who use Juul and vape and all that sort of stuff, that's still big tobacco. It's still stuff that's going to kill you in the long run. And it's even more concentrated and has even more different kind of chemicals in it. And so think about that the next time you think that that's a good idea, that you are lining pockets of big tobacco and you're helping them make a tremendous amount of money while you are going to reap the benefits in big medical bills in your future. So think about what you're doing with your life. All right, and the secret is off their soapbox. All right, but then we get the Monica Lewinsky scandal. Okay, so, oh, Clinton, why? Okay, so prior to Clinton's time as president of the United States, there are some accusations of sexual harassment and assault by multiple women in other parts of his life. Okay? That's vaguely known, but it's going to come back. In his the beginning stages of his presidency, there's an investigation into a real estate deal called Whitewater, not to be confused with Watergate, that people are looking into. As people are looking into that, they're going to extend that into an investigation into the president's relationship with women. They don't ever find anything with the real estate thing. There's nothing to really stick to Clinton with that. But the stuff with women is much more scandalous, and that sort of stuff will stick. So Paula Jones, I don't have a picture of her on here. She's going to accuse the president of sexual harassment. She, in that process, will find out about Lewinsky, and I'll get to Lewinsky in just a second. And so they're trying to pressure Lewinsky to testify against the president, and Lewinsky does not want to, right? But that information is going to get leaked to Kenneth Starr, who is a special prosecutor, and Kenneth Starr will run with that. Okay? All right, so this is Monica Lewinsky right here. Monica Lewinsky is a 21-year-old intern that starts to have an affair with the president of the United States. Okay, so She is a lowly intern. She's 21 years old, and she is having an affair, one-sided affair, with the president of the United States, the most powerful man in the world. Okay? She thinks that it's consensual. We'll talk about whether it actually is in a second. But she starts to tell her friend, who she thinks is her friend, Linda Tripp, about her relationship with the president of the United States. And Linda Tripp is actually recording these conversations and giving them to, I think, the lawyers of Paula Jones, as well as some other people. Linda Tripp will convince Monica Lewinsky to save a blue dress that has DNA evidence of this relationship with the president. I'll let you use your imagination about what kind of DNA evidence from the husband would be, or from the president of the United States would be on that blue dress. Okay. All right. But as this starts to come out, and if you want this podcast, is slow burn. It's also about NIxon, or the first season is about NIxon. This one and tonight I think is actually even better than the NIxon one, kind of talking about all the decisions that are made in this investigation. But essentially, all of these women that are part of this scandal are kind of treated as either right-wing pawns in Linda Tripp, okay, or left-wing punching bags, as they're such a conversation about, the words that are used to describe Monica Lewinsky, and women's actions in this. We are getting one step closer to Me Too with this. Monica Lewinsky, since this scandal, has been an activist against bullying, because the attacks against her were terrible at this moment in time. But we didn't have Twitter. We didn't have the internet the way that we do now. And so she recognized that she's very lucky that she didn't have to deal with that. Right? She's also an interesting person because her views of the event have changed over time. In the beginning, she very much felt like this was a consensual relationship with the president of the United States, and she felt like she was in love with him. Since then, she's definitely changed. Her opinion and the way that we interpret the relationship has changed. Some women at that time said, this is a liberating thing. This is a woman that is deciding who it is that she's going to have a relationship. But now, when we're having a conversation about what is consent, how do we consent to a relationship, there are many people that say Monica Lewinsky can't actually consent in this situation to having a relationship with the president, whether it's an affair or not, because of not only the age gap, okay, but also the power gap. She is a young intern, and he is the president of the United States, the most powerful man. He's not somebody that you can easily say no to. In the same way, it's not 100% the same thing, but what we might think of as like a minor and a teacher. That minor can't consent to a relationship with a teacher or an adult. That not only is there an age problem, but there's also a power dynamic. Those things are not allowed. And so we might think about a lot of that with what's happening with Monica Lewinsky. Okay? All right. So Clinton will be impeached. Just like Trump, just like Nixon was on the way to get impeached. And the charges that they will bring up against Clinton are perjury for lying under oath, and obstruction of justice, witness tampering, and abuse of authority. Right? So he gets impeached by the House, and then it will go to the Senate to try him, essentially. And the Senate will actually reject both of those, or all of those charges. And so he'll get to keep his job. He does get a 5-year law license suspension, and he does have to pay a fine. It's a complicated one, and he doesn't really feel the repercussions completely of perhaps what it is that he did. But it's also complicated because in many of the other cases, the special prosecutor has been a pretty upstanding, non-controversial person. Like Robert Mueller, who was the special prosecutor in the Trump stuff, pretty upstanding person for decades. Kenneth Starr is not that. Interesting enough, Kenneth Starr actually was on the legal team for Trump in Trump's own impeachment stuff, so he essentially switched sides. But Kenneth Starr is, there's some pretty unsavory things that he did, particularly when he went after Monica Lewinsky and really throwing Monica Lewinsky under the bus and open to attacks. But the other thing is, once he is done being special prosecutor, he will actually be the president of Baylor, and he, at his time in Baylor, the football team is gets in trouble for gang rape, and he gets in trouble for essentially helping to try and cover that up or quiet that, and so he will actually resign from that position in Baylor. So I would not argue that Kenneth Starr is an upstanding individual. Not that I think what Trump or what Clinton did was right, but Kenneth Starr is not a stellar prosecutor trying to find justice. Yeah, clicking buttons. Okay. But now we talked about lots of presidents with scandals. So I want to take a second to just kind of make sure we're clear on the different scandals. So number one, Nixon, he's getting in trouble for interference with an election, right? Reagan and Bush with the Iran-Contra scandal, they are getting in trouble for breaking laws and misleading Congress. Clinton's investigation has to do with real estate and affairs or harassment of and assault of women, essentially. Okay? Trump, interference with election and a foreign government quid pro quo. I point this out because while none of these things that these presidents have done are good things, okay, and there should be consequences perhaps for their actions, Clinton's is different because his wrongdoing is not about violating the Constitution in the same way or government. It's not about his relationship with the American people. It's about him making personally stupid decisions, okay, or morally wrong decisions. Whereas the other ones are different. Okay? So we might think of it as these are all accusations of obstruction of justice, and most of them include perjury. So they're getting in the way of justice, and they are lying, right, under oath. But they're not the same level of harming democracy or upholding the Constitution, right? And again, this is not Ms. Dietrich saying, that what Clinton did was right. And I think I would never want to be in a room alone with Clinton. I would never want any women that I know to be in a room alone with Clinton. But they're different levels of scandals, right? So it's important that we at least recognize the differences between those guys. All right. Some other things I want to make sure we know the difference between. Number one, deficit and debt. The deficit is just a single year, the difference between how much the government is taking and how much they're spending in a single year. But if we add up all those deficits, all those negative numbers, we're going to get the national debt, and that's a total amount of debt. If we compare these last three presidents, Reagan's going to be our Teflon great communicator. Bush Sr. is going to be our magnet for a lot of negative things, and then Clinton, we tend to have selective memory. The economy looks really good, even if there's a lot of other things that perhaps Clinton was not so successful on. Right? For Reagan, economic and social change is going to be more important, term one. Foreign policy, more important, term two. Much larger than any of these three presidents, or like the politics is much larger than any of these three. But we do see a rise in conservatism, and then maybe a little bit of a move to the center, but still a continuous rise of conservatism and a backlash to the 1960s in all of these administrations. Having said that, things are far less partisan at this time than they are now. You might still be able to have a civil conversation with somebody who thinks differently at this moment, whereas that's much more difficult today, right? We can't even agree whether there's actually a pandemic going on. But we do see that changing public opinion is sometimes more important than even legislative change. It's how these politicians make us feel. It's how these presidents make us feel, and they can convince us of different things. So you see the conservatives have a goal to end social programs, okay? And they are pretty effective with that because they're selling a narrative that you have to cut these social programs because you have a deficit because of military spending. So again, it's kind of this self-fulfilling prophecy. Okay? Immigration. You're going to see immigration grow over all of these presidents, and you're going to see more of, I would argue, a humane attempt to deal with immigration and offer things like amnesty, okay, and putting pressure on businesses. Like we talk a lot in this country about immigrants stealing jobs, but somebody has to hire them. And so if you really think that you shouldn't have undocumented people in the country, then perhaps you should go after businesses that continue to hire undocumented people. And so this is an era of more willingness to compromise on immigration and more pressure put on businesses. There are some things going on with Israel and Palestine and the Middle East, but I'm not really going to get into them on this kind of save. I'm just not, for the sake of this class, going to get into them. All right, a little bit of a break. Get some music. Here's some 2000s music. This is stuff that you were probably pretty familiar with. Many of them are still making music today. Oh, great. And then we are going to get the 2000 election. Okay, this is going to be one of the closest, tightest, most controversial elections that we have had up until this point. Maybe 2016 is even more so, but this is a doozy. Okay. All right, so you have George Bush and Dick Cheney against Al Gore and Joe Lieberman. Okay? If you look at the electoral difference, it's 271 to 266. So only 5 electoral votes separate these guys. But then if you look at the popular vote, you have 50.455. So 50,455,000. And then you have 50,992,000. So when it comes to the popular vote, Al Gore won. More people voted for Al Gore, but Bush won the Electoral College, okay, by only 5. So it's really, really close. And it all comes down to a single state, okay? It all comes down to Florida, okay? So again, you have Al Gore. He had been Clinton's VP, right? So he's trying to separate himself from Clinton. He wants to connect to all the positive stuff, but he wants to leave behind all of the scandal stuff. And then you have George Bush, Bush Jr., who is Bush Sr.'s son, who had been the Texas governor. And then you also have a third-party candidate in Ralph Nader, but we're not really going to talk about him. Okay? So both the popular and the electoral vote are very, very close. It comes all the way down just to Florida, which is 25 electoral votes. So whatever way Florida goes is the way that the election is going to go. Okay? So the day of the election, that's going to go back and forth, who's winning Florida, what's going to happen. Okay? By the end of the day, they're going to declare that Bush is the winner. Okay? Gore will even call Bush and say, congratulations, I'm conceding. But then they start to raise some questions about, perhaps that's not what happened. And so Gore actually calls back and says, just kidding, game on. We're going to figure out what's happening. And the Democrats start to raise some questions about the ballots. And they want a hand count. Okay? They want a recount of what's happening in Florida. The reason that this is even more complicated is the governor of Florida is actually Jeb Bush, which is George Bush's brother. Okay, so it comes down to Florida, where Bush's brother is the governor, and there's some questions about what's going on with some votes. So for many people, this looks like some shady stuff. So ultimately, this is going to go all the way to the Supreme Court. So there's a while where we actually don't know who's going to be president as they kind of wait for the Supreme Court to answer. And what the Supreme Court says is that there's not going to be a recount because there's no clear standards by which the ballots are to be counted, and there's no time to create one. So essentially, we don't have a system to recount set in stone. We don't have a way to do this. We've never had to do this before, and so we're just not going to. We're not touching this, which is kind of a crazy way to be like, well, I guess Bush gets to say because we just don't want to touch this issue. So Bush will become president. This is just an example of why the Democrats were upset and why they wanted a recount or why they had questions about voting in Florida. So this is called a butterfly ballot. And so I want you to just take a second to look at that, figure out if you could figure out who you would vote for or how you would vote. So for example, if you were trying to vote for Al Gore for the Democratic candidate, you need to punch this third one, right? Not the second one, because if you punch the second one, you're actually voting for the Reform Party. You're voting for Pat Buchanan. And so there's this one. Although for the Republican, it's the easiest. You would just vote for this first guy. And so people have some concerns about the way that this is done. But it doesn't matter because the Supreme Court says you're just going to leave it the way it is. So Bush is going to come into power knowing that a majority did not vote for him and that people are pretty grumpy about the outcome of this election. And so he says things like, I was not elected to serve one party, but to serve one nation. The President of the United States is the president of every single American, of every race and every background. Whether you voted for me or not, I will do my best to serve your interests and I will work to earn your respect. So really trying to say to the American people, like, I understand, but I'm here to serve you all. I want to be a president to all Americans, not just those who voted for me. All right, so what did his domestic policies look like? Unfortunately for Bush, in his first year, not only is he going to deal with the terrorist attack, he also is going to deal with a recession. And part of that is because, remember how I mentioned that Clinton has all this positive economic growth because of the dot-com industry? Well, Bush is going to be president when that bursts. And so he's not responsible for that. He's only responsible for the way that he responds, but he does inherit this negative thing. So he's also going to have to deal with some major corporate scandals. Enron was a big energy company that was essentially cooking their books, right? And so one of the things that he's going to do, though, or his administration and Congress is going to do, is to cut taxes. It's a campaign promise. It's meant to spur the economy, except that it doesn't spur the economy. And part of the reason that also won't happen is because of 9/11. And the reason that 9/11 is going to continue the recession is after a terrorist attack, people don't want to fly. They don't want to travel. And so a lot of those industries are going to get hurt. So even though the economy is not doing so great, even though there's a deficit and it's growing, Bush will authorize more tax cuts in 2003. So you see tax cuts, but you see a continuing deficit, right? Or that's continuing to grow. We'll also see a bipartisan No Child Left Behind. This is a way, it's a bipartisan attempt to fix education or improve education, but really what it's doing is like teaching to the test and a lot of teaching to the test and focus on how you fill in bubbles rather than authentic learning. The other thing is it will give schools a rating, and so this is like the new redlining because people are making decisions based where they buy houses based off of the grades of the schools. And again, that's so tied to race and segregation exists. So it's a continuation of those policies. So again, it's a bipartisan idea. It's also a bipartisan failure, absolute failure. Under Bush, we also see faith-based initiatives. This is kind of a weird thing. He's essentially trying to funnel federal money into faith-based groups, so religious groups. And he does this through executive action or orders. The reason that people have questions about this is that seems to be a violation of the First Amendment and freedom of religion and what's known as the Establishment Clause, essentially that government should not play favorites when it comes to religion. And it seems like that might be what they're doing. He doesn't really have any patience for the environment, for climate change, for stem cell research or scientific research. He would just rather not deal with those things. On stem cell research or scientific research, he's going to essentially say that's because it's against his religion. So this is essentially a pause on a lot of that scientific stuff that I think is pretty dang important. All right, and then we're going to get into 9/11, but I want to make sure that we understand some terms before we move on. We as Americans tend to be really naive, very, very much stereotype people and not take the time to learn about other cultures. So I want to make sure that we do that. So number one, extremism. It means that you are outside the mainstream, usually politics or religion. So you are so radical that you're like outside the purview of what normal human beings would think. Okay? Terrorism is violence for political means. Okay? So you're committing an act of violence in order to expand or progress some sort of political ideology. Okay? When we say the word Arab, we're talking about an ethnicity, a culture, or a linguistic base. So that's not religious. Okay, so that's why we talk about an area as we've been talking about kind of conflict, we've been talking about Arab neighbors versus Israel. Okay, so the Arab part of the world versus Israel. Okay, Islam is a religion. Okay, so you could be Arab but not Muslim, which is a name for people who follow the Islamic faith. Okay? Under Islam, so under that religion, you have two sects, much like you would see in Christianity or Judaism and things of that nature. Jihad is a word that you've probably heard a lot, but you probably don't understand what it means. We commonly refer to it as a holy war, but it just means a struggle, whether that's a struggle against somebody when it comes to religion or a personal struggle. Okay? ISIS ISIS does not come about until after we've already been in country for quite a long time in both Afghanistan and Iraq for quite a while. But these are a radical anti-Western militant group that are devoted to establishing an independent Islamic state in the region. Right? They adhere to an extreme interpretation of Sunni Islam. All right, so 9/11. I'm not going to go over it in great detail because I have a feeling that you know something about this, even though you guys were born after this. You guys make me feel old sometimes. All right, anyway, so we know that there were plane crashes, 2 plane crashes into the Twin Towers, a plane crash into the Pentagon, and then one that crashed in a field in Pennsylvania that was likely headed for the White House. In total, we know about 3,000 people die in that attack. And many first responders will die in the process or in the coming days after that. This is going to be a unique time of unity that kind of brings the country together in their grief and their anger. And also their appreciation for first responders. So a lot of people will participate in charities or blood drives kind of as a show of patriotic force. There's a lot of appreciation for Rudy Giuliani's leadership in New York as the mayor of New York. He has done a lot lately to make sure that we forget that at one moment he was well respected by all Americans. But at this moment in time, people appreciate his leadership, at least for this part. Okay. Bush is really clear to say after this terrorist attack that it's not Muslims or Arabs that they're after, but just terrorists. Except that he's quick to tell the international community, either you are with us or you are with the terrorists. So you either have to side with the United States or you're just as bad as the terrorists or you're even helping the terrorists. And that extreme view is going to have consequences. And we'll see that kind of with the commission. So there's a 9/11 commission that kind of looks at Congress's response and the government's response to 9/11. And they say, yeah, we made a lot of mistakes. Number one, the people responsible for this have been planning this for years. We should have been able to respond to that or perhaps prevent this. The other thing they said, we need to tread really carefully on people's rights. There is a attempt to surveil more people and to prevent attacks from happening in the future. But this commission really says, be really careful. Like you need to still protect people's freedoms, and we still have this thing called a constitution and a bill of rights. All right, so background on it. The mastermind behind it is Osama bin Laden. He's actually not from Afghanistan. He's from Saudi Arabia, and he's going to form what is known as Al-Qaeda or the base. And he's involved in multiple attacks against the United States. So the first World Trade Center attack in 1993, as well as an attack on a U.S. ship. They've been planning 9/11 for quite a while. These are the guys that kind of are involved in I'm covering her face. Bush's foreign policy. I'm not going to go over the details of all of them. I challenge you to maybe get acquainted with some of them. I did talk about Condoleezza Rice earlier because she grew up when she was very young in Birmingham, and she's the family that flees to Colorado after the church bombing that kills those four girls. Okay? But I do point out that in the 2000 election, there was very little focus on foreign policy. And so not too many people were paying attention to the difference between Gore and Bush when it comes to foreign policy. But it's going to be a really big deal on and how America responds to the terrorist attack. And I would argue that Al Gore would have done something different. And so that just has consequences. Like we can't go back and change it. And we didn't know what was coming. Like us as the average Americans didn't know what was coming. But it has consequences. Who becomes president has even more consequences than we could have imagined. All right, so what we're going to see is this war on terror, which is how the Bush administration will classify this. Okay? And again, Bush says, we will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them. So what happens is the Taliban is who's in charge of Afghanistan, and they are ruling by Islamic law. They are not part of 9/11 or the attack themselves, but Osama bin Laden is in Afghanistan, and the Taliban will not give up Osama bin Laden, okay, or we think that's where he is. And so because of that, we're going to go to war in Afghanistan. So again, Afghanistan did not plan 9/11. Okay? They just won't help the United States find the people who did, essentially. Right? We will quickly defeat the Taliban, but we don't find bin Laden. That's also because he's not actually there and he's hiding down in Pakistan. Ultimately, it will take over a decade for us to find bin Laden and to kill bin Laden in 2011. Okay? One of the other consequences of 9/11 is we see the creation of the Department of Homeland Security. So this is essentially keeping the homeland secure or safe. Okay? This is the last of the executive branch's cabinet positions that have been made. We also are going to get what's known as the anthrax scare, which is a bacteria as a white powder, or can be produced as a white powder, and it actually gets mailed to people, and people will die. But even though it's not connected to 9/11, it's still the same when people are dying. It seems like there's an attack on Americans, and so people are really scared. There's so many things to be afraid of at that moment, right? And that's why Congress overwhelmingly is going to support what is known as the U.S. Patriot Act, which gives the government more power to track down domestic terrorists, makes it easier to spy and collect data on citizens. And so this is what I was talking about with the commission in the last slide, that they are willing to erode some of our freedoms or our rights in order to keep us safe. And we can think about all the other times we've done this in U.S. history where we put safety or security over our individual freedoms. And these are important things for you to think about yourself. What of your freedoms are you willing to give up to get safety, and vice versa? This might be good things for us to think about right now in the middle of a pandemic. What are you willing to give up in order to keep us safe? Is wearing a face mask something that we do as part of a community and as part of a country that we're willing to do that? Or is that an invasion on our freedoms and nobody can tell us what to do with ourselves? Those are maybe questions that we should ask. I should argue it's not the same as giving the government the right to spy on you, that wearing a face mask is a reasonable thing to do to show that you have compassion for your community. But there are many people that feel like that is, a violation of our freedoms right now. All right, which is why I'm going to ask you to think about these questions as one of your your journal entries about the Patriot Act, whether you think it is providing security or violating our freedoms, as well as how do we kind of prevent an erosion of our rights in a global pandemic where we're thinking about how do we trace a disease? How do we do that without maybe violating our personal rights? All right, I have talked plenty, so I'm going to go ahead and end that, which means I'm going to need one more lecture to wrap this up. Hopefully the last one will be fast, and then we will be done with this thing. All right, see you all later.